The homeless man who saved my life told me not to start my truck as I was heading to my wife's estate meeting. When I asked why he showed me my cut brake lines, someone wanted me dead before I could walk into that law office and expose how my own family was stealing my wife's inheritance. Follow my story to the end and comment your city so I can see how far this reaches. I'm Richard Whitmore, 66-year-old machinist from Cedar Ridge, Texas, and they picked the wrong old man to betray. 5 minutes earlier, I was just another widower heading to settle his wife's estate. Clara had been gone 3 months, cancer taking her slow and mean through a winter that felt like it would never end. And the lawyers at Morrison and Associates said it was time to finalize everything. Simple paperwork, they said. Nothing complicated. Just sign a few documents and walk away with what my wife left me after 42 years of marriage. The parking garage beneath the law office felt cold even in the Texas heat concrete walls, echoing my footsteps like a tomb. I was fumbling for my keys, thinking about how Clara always insisted on coming with me to these kinds of meetings. She'd sit there in her best navy dress, the one with the pearl buttons she'd sewn on herself, asking questions I was too polite to ask, making sure nobody tried to slip anything past us. Clara had a way of cutting through lawyer talk that made grown men in $1,000 suits squirm in their chairs. "Richard," she'd say in that voice she used when she meant business, "explain to me again why we need 3 signatures for something that should take 1. And they would explain because when Clara Whitmore fixed you with those green eyes and that no-nonsense stare, you explained. Now I was doing this alone, and the weight of that solitude pressed down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Every important decision for the past 4 decades had been made together, sitting at our kitchen table with coffee and Clara's yellow legal pad, working through the pros and cons until we both felt good about the choice. Now it was just me walking into a law office to handle the final business of the woman who'd been my partner in everything that mattered. That's when Eddie Kowalski stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. "Don't start that truck, Mr. Whitmore." I stopped key halfway to the ignition. Eddie was maybe 55, wearing clothes that had seen better days, but clean-pressed neat as he could manage. His hair was unkempt, graying at the temples, and he had the weathered look of someone who'd been sleeping rough, but his eyes were steady. Not crazy, not threatening, worried. The way a man looks when he's got bad news he doesn't want to deliver, but knows he has to. "Sir, I know how this looks, but someone wants you signing papers you'll regret or dead before you can sign anything at all. I've worked with men all my life, good men and bad men, honest men and liars." Something in Eddie's voice told me he wasn't trying to con me. He kept his distance, hands visible, respectful. The kind of man who understood that approaching someone in a parking garage required a certain protocol if you didn't want them running for the elevator. I used to work for Morrison and Associates upstairs, paralegal for 12 years before they fired me 3 weeks ago. Your daughter-in-law, Maisie, has been in contact with certain people at the firm. There are documents, things she's had prepared. Maisie, my son, Michael's wife of 8 years. Sweet girl who called me dad and brought casseroles after Clara's funeral. The woman who sat beside Clara's hospital bed reading romance novels aloud when the morphine made sleeping hard, who held my wife's hand during the bad spells and sang hymns in a voice soft as morning rain. "What are you talking about?" "Pop the hood, sir. Look at the brake lines." I've worked with my hands long enough to know when something's been tampered with. The brake fluid was leaking dark against the concrete, a steady drip that caught the fluorescent light like black tears. The rubber line was scored clean by a blade, not frayed from age or wear. Cut. Professional work, the kind that would fail, gradual, like maybe on a steep hill or coming up to a red light when you needed stopping power most. Jesus Christ! I breathed, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. Eddie pulled out a manila envelope, worn and taped twice at the flap, like it had been through hell and back. "She's been paying Morrison to forge documents, make it look like you're losing your mind. They want you declared incompetent so Michael can control everything through a trust." My mouth went dry as West Texas dust. "That's impossible. I've never been diagnosed with anything. I'm perfectly fine." I balanced my checkbook last week, paid my taxes early, remembered every birthday and anniversary on my calendar. I know, sir. That's why I've been waiting here hoping to catch you before the meeting. She wasn't expecting you to show up today. She told Mr. Morrison you probably wouldn't even remember the appointment. The anger hit me like a physical force, hot and clean and righteous. How dare she question my mental state? How dare anyone suggest I was losing my grip on reality? I'd been running machinery that could take a man's arm off if he wasn't paying attention, been responsible for million-dollar contracts, been trusted by union brothers who knew the difference between sharp and dull, competent and dangerous. Mr. Whitmore, your wife's estate is worth over $2 million. Your son and daughter-in-law owe over $300,000 in debt. House payments, credit cards, a business loan that went bad when the construction market collapsed. Do the math. The numbers hit like a punch to the gut, driving the air from my lungs. All those expensive vacations Maisie was always posting on Facebook, pictures of her and Michael on beaches in Mexico, ski slopes in Colorado, cruise ships in the Caribbean, the big house in Maple Ridge with the swimming pool and 3-car garage, the BMW in the driveway, the designer clothes and jewelry that showed up for every family gathering. Michael's consulting business I thought was thriving, built on referrals and reputation, and the kind of steady growth that meant security. All of it built on borrowed money. All of it a house of cards waiting for the wind to blow. Why tell me this? I asked, studying Eddie's face for any sign of deception, any tell that would mark him as another con man looking for an angle. Eddie's face softened, and I saw something there I recognized. The look of a man who'd lost everything that mattered, but still had his conscience intact. The expression of someone who'd been knocked down so hard that getting back up required choosing what kind of person you wanted to be. Your wife treated me like a human being when she came to the office with coffee and questions about your estate paperwork. Always said please and thank you, asked about my family, remembered my grandson's name from one visit to the next. When they fired me for asking too many questions about files that kept changing timestamps at midnight, when they had security escort me out like I was some kind of criminal, I decided someone should warn you. I looked at this man who'd lost his job, probably his apartment, maybe everything he owned, to protect a stranger. A man who could have stayed silent, could have let whatever was going to happen just happen, but chose instead to risk what little he had left to do what was right. What do you need me to do? Walk in there with me. Let me show them what I know. But first, you need to call building security about your truck. Get it on record that someone sabotaged your vehicle in their garage. I pulled out my phone and dialed, keeping my voice steady as I reported the vandalism to the building's security desk. The guard on duty said they'd send someone down immediately and pull the surveillance footage from the past week. Standard procedure, he said, for anything involving vehicle tampering in their facility. You ready to take on a room full of lawyers? I asked Eddie, adjusting my hat and straightening my shoulders. He managed a smile, the first one I'd seen from him since this conversation started. Mr. Whitmore, I've already lost everything that matters to a system that protects people like them. What's left to be afraid of? As the elevator climbed to the 15th floor, I found myself thinking about Michael. Not the 33-year-old man who'd apparently stood by while his wife planned to destroy me, but the boy I'd raised with Clara's help and my own 2 hands. The 8-year-old who'd broken Clara's favorite vase, the blue one her grandmother had brought over from Ireland, and tried to hide it by sweeping up the pieces and throwing them away, like the evidence would just disappear. When we found out, and we always found out in our house because Clara had a way of knowing when something was wrong, I made him tell his mother the truth. Then we drove to 3 different antique stores until we found one exactly like it, spending most of my paycheck that week to make things right. Why do I have to tell her He'd asked, tears in his eyes as we sat in the truck outside the first store. She's going to be so mad at me. Because the truth is, the only foundation you can build on, I told him, my hand on his small shoulder. Everything else is just sand, son. Lies will wash away the first time it rains, but the truth will hold up your whole house. 20 years old, fresh out of college with a business degree that made Clara so proud, she carried his graduation picture in her wallet until the day she died. Working his first construction job that summer, coming home covered in dust and sweat and more pride than a young man should be able to carry. "Awad, Dad, I measured every board twice today just like you taught me," he'd said over dinner, Clara's pot roast with carrots and potatoes making the whole kitchen smell like home. Foreman said I was the most careful worker he'd seen in years. Measure twice, cut once. I'd said, ruffling his hair that was still thick and brown, then before stress and worry had started to silver it at the temples. That's how you build something that lasts. Clara had been so proud that night watching our boy learn the value of honest work with his hands. She'd made his favorite dessert apple pie with ice cream, and we'd sat around our kitchen table talking about his plans for the future. He was going to start his own business someday, he said. Build something solid, something that would stand the test of time, something he could pass down to his own children. Where had that young man gone? When had he started believing lies were easier than truth? When had he forgotten that the strongest foundation was always built on bedrock, not shifting sand? The elevator dinged. 15th floor. "You sure about this, Mr. Whitmore?" Eddie asked, adjusting the manila envelope under his arm like it contained explosives. I thought of Clara's last words to me in the hospital, her hand weak in mine, but her voice still strong, still carrying that note of steel that had gotten her through raising a son and building a marriage and fighting cancer for 3 years before it finally won. "Richard, don't let anyone rewrite our story. We built something good together. Don't let them tear it down just because I'm not here to help you defend it." "I'm sure," I said, and pressed the button to open the doors. The reception area of Morrison and Associates screamed expensive money from every polished surface. Mahogany furniture that cost more than most people's cars' marble floors. You could see your reflection in artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum instead of a law office. All paid for by families like mine, I realized. People who trusted these lawyers with their most precious things and got betrayed for their trouble. Behind the reception desk sat a woman maybe 40 years old, blonde hair, perfect makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was part of the job. She looked up when we walked in, and I saw her eyes take in Eddie's worn clothes, my work boots, the manila envelope that had seen better days. "Mr. Whitmore?" She said, her smile practiced but warm enough to seem genuine. "They're waiting for you in conference room A. Right on time." "Good," I said, Eddie beside me like a shadow. "We're ready? Will your friend be joining the meeting?" she asked, and I caught the slight emphasis on friend that suggested she was wondering if Eddie belonged in a law office at all. "He's got business here too," I said simply. "Business that concerns the same people we're meeting with." Through the frosted glass of conference room A, I could see 3 figures around the conference table. I recognized Maisie's silhouette immediately, that careful posture she always maintained like she was posing for a photograph. When I opened the door, her face went white as fresh paint on a summer fence. "Richard." She recovered quickly, that same sweet smile I'd seen across Sunday dinner tables for 8 years, the same expression she'd worn when she thanked me for walking her down the aisle at her wedding, because her own father had been too drunk to show up. "I wasn't expecting you to come today." Right there. She'd given herself away with 6 words that hit me like a slap across the face. Of course I'd come to my own wife's estate settlement. What kind of man wouldn't show up to handle his beloved wife's final business? What kind of husband would miss the last official act of a 42-year marriage? Morrison stood from his place at the head of the table, extending his hand like we were old friends meeting for lunch at the country club. Silver-haired snake in a suit that cost more than my truck with manicured nails, and a smile that probably looked reassuring to people who didn't know any better. "Mr. Whitmore, please have a seat. We have some important documents that require your attention today. I know this must be difficult handling Clara's affairs, but we'll try to make it as painless as possible." I sat down Eddie beside me. Maisie couldn't stop staring at him, her eyes darting between his face and the envelope he carried, like it contained something that could explode and destroy everything she'd worked for. The third person at the table was a woman maybe 35 years old, sharp-eyed and predatory, in the way of someone who'd clawed their way up through law school and junior partnerships by being willing to do things other people wouldn't. Her nameplate read Carla Dean Associate, and she had the look of someone who billed hours like her life depended on it. "Who's your friend, Mr. Whitmore?" Morrison asked, trying to sound casual but unable to keep the tension from creeping into his voice. "Someone who knows the truth," I said simply. "Eddie, show them what you brought." Eddie placed his envelope on the polished conference table like he was laying down a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. The sound of paper against wood seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. "This is Mr. Whitmore's real will." Eddie set his voice steady as a man who'd found his courage again. "Dated 6 months before Mrs. Clara Whitmore passed away. Signed and witnessed properly by 2 men from local Union 447. Morrison's practiced smile flickered like a candle in the wind. "I'm sure there's some confusion here, Mr. Kowalski. Estate documents go through many drafts during the planning process. It's not unusual for there to be multiple versions." "No confusion," Eddie interrupted, and I heard 40 years of union meetings in his voice, the tone of a man who'd faced down bosses and bureaucrats and company lawyers who thought they could intimidate working people into accepting less than they deserved. This is what Mrs. Clara Whitmore actually wanted. Everything goes to her husband exactly as they planned for 42 years of marriage. I pulled out the document Morrison had been planning to have me sign, the one that had been sitting in front of my place at the table like a trap waiting to spring. The pages were thick, expensive paper, the kind that was supposed to make you feel like you were signing something important and official. "This document you want me to sign today?" I said, my voice carrying the weight of 45 years of honest work. "Sets up Michael as trustee of a trust that pays me $40,000 a year, while you use the rest of my wife's money to cover my son's debts." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Carla Dean's pen stopped moving across her legal pad. Morrison's hand froze halfway to his water glass, and Maisie's hands started trembling so hard she had to clasp them together to make it stop. "Richard, you need protection," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the tone of someone who'd rehearsed this speech a dozen times in front of her bathroom mirror. "The doctor said your memory has been getting worse. They're concerned about your ability to handle complex financial decisions." "What doctors?" I cut her off, my voice harder than I'd ever used with her before, harder than I'd used with anyone in my family since Michael was 16 and came home drunk from a party. "I've had the same physician for 20 years, Dr. Peterson at Cedar Ridge Medical Center. Not this Dr. Latham, who supposedly diagnosed me with early-stage dementia." Her face started to crumble, the careful mask she'd worn for so long finally beginning to slip like makeup in the Texas heat. I could see the real Maisie underneath, desperate and scared and caught in a lie so big it was collapsing under its own weight. "Maisie," I said, leaning forward, keeping my voice quiet, but letting the steel show through the way Clara had taught me when we were raising Michael. "Look at me. Tell me why you did this." She looked at Morrison, whose face had gone pale as winter sky. She looked at Carla Dean, who was frantically scribbling notes like she could write her way out of whatever legal trouble was heading their way. She looked at Eddie with his damning envelope, then back at me. For a moment, I saw not the manipulative woman who'd been plotting against me for months, but the scared young woman who'd married my son when she was 25 and trying to build a life out of nothing. The girl who'd grown up in foster care, who'd aged out of the system at 18 with a high school diploma and no family to speak of, who'd worked her way through dental hygienist school on student loans and sheer determination. "We're drowning Richard," she said, tears starting to fall like the first drops of a summer storm. The house has 2 mortgages. Michael's business is failing. We owe money to credit cards to the bank, to people who loan money to people like us who can't get it anywhere else. When Clara got sick, when we realized how much the estate was worth, you decided to steal from me. We would have taken care of you." The words came out sharp, defensive, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "The trust would have covered all your expenses. You would have had everything you needed. A nice place to live, people to help you with daily tasks, medical care. On $40,000 a year, while you paid off your $300,000 in debt with my wife's money." The room went silent, except for the hum of air conditioning and Maisie's quiet crying. Morrison was frantically shuffling papers, probably trying to hide evidence or figure out how to salvage this disaster. Carla Dean looked like she was calculating how much this was going to cost her career. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway, steady and purposeful, the sound of someone who belonged wherever they decided to walk. The door opened without a knock, and Detective Sarah Chen walked in, badge visible on her belt, looking like she'd been expecting this moment for weeks. "Nobody moves," she said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with liars and criminals and people who thought they were smarter than the law. "We've been monitoring this office for 3 weeks, Mr. Morrison. Mr. Kowalski, thank you for wearing the wire." Eddie opened his worn jacket with the careful movements of a man who understood that sudden gestures around police officers were generally a bad idea. A small recording device was clipped to his shirt, red light blinking steadily like a tiny heartbeat. "You got it all?" I asked, though I could see from Chen's expression that she had. Chen nodded. "Every word. The forged documents, the fake medical records, the plan to have you declared incompetent, the conspiracy to defraud you of your inheritance. More than enough for multiple felony charges." Maisie put her face in her hands and started sobbing, real tears this time, the kind that come from a place so deep you can't fake them, even if you wanted to. Morrison was already reaching for his phone, probably calling his own lawyer, which struck me as the first smart thing he'd done all day. But I was looking at the empty chair where Michael should have been sitting. My son, the man I'd raised to value honesty and hard work, who wasn't even brave enough to face his father, while his wife tried to destroy everything we'd built. As if summoned by my thoughts, Michael finally walked through the door. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month, his usually neat appearance disheveled, dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the kind of stress that ate you from the inside out. His shoulders sagged like a man carrying a weight too heavy for him, and when he saw Detective Chen, whatever color was left in his face drained away completely. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking on the single word like ice breaking up in spring. I didn't know it would go this far. I stood up, looked at this man, who'd once been my pride and joy, who I'd taught to swing a hammer and drive a nail straight, who'd carried my toolbox when he was 6 years old and begged me to let him help with projects around the house. "What did you know, son? Maisie said you were forgetting things." Getting confused. "She showed me pictures of you at the grocery store, said you couldn't remember how to use your credit card, that you'd gotten lost driving to the bank. She had medical records, and you believed her. She had documentation, Dad. Medical notes, witness statements from neighbors. People saying you'd been acting strange, talking to yourself, leaving the stove on. Mrs. Henderson from next door, Bob Martinez from the church, even Pastor Williams said he was worried about you." Eddie spoke up, his voice cutting through Michael's explanations like a blade through butter. "All forgeries, every single piece of paper. Your wife paid neighbors with grocery store gift cards to sign false statements about your father, $50 worth of cards for each statement." Michael's face went white as he processed this information. I watched him realize how completely he'd been played, how thoroughly his wife had manipulated him into doubting his own father. "The debt is real, Dad?" he said, his voice barely audible. "We really are drowning. The business is hemorrhaging money. The house is mortgaged twice over. We owe $40,000 on credit cards alone. I thought if we could just get control of the estate for a few years, we could pay everything off and then give it all back to you. Why didn't you just ask for help? Your mother and I would have helped you rebuild the right way." He looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. Pride. Stupid, stubborn pride. I didn't want you to know I'd failed. I didn't want you to see that your son couldn't make it on his own. Detective Chen was gathering files, taking statements, reading rights to people who'd thought they were too smart to get caught. Morrison and Carla Dean were in handcuffs, being led away by officers who'd been waiting in the hallway. Maisie sat at the conference table looking like a woman who'd just watched her whole world collapse in real time. "Dad," Michael said, moving closer to me with the hesitant steps of a man who wasn't sure he'd be welcome. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to ask. Can you ever forgive me?" I studied his face, looking for the boy I'd raised somewhere in the man who'd betrayed me. The child who'd learned to ride a bike in our driveway, who'd helped me build Clara's garden shed, who'd cried when his goldfish died and asked if fish went to heaven. "Michael, when you were 8 years old, you broke your mother's favorite vase. Do you remember what you did?" He nodded, shame written across his features like words carved in stone. I tried to hide it, swept up the pieces and threw them away. "And when we found out, you made me tell Mom the truth. Then we went to 3 different stores until we found one exactly like it." "Why?" "Because you said the truth is the only foundation you can build on. Everything else is just sand." I picked up my hat from the conference table, settled it on my head with the automatic gesture of a man who'd been wearing hats to work for 45 years. "Your wife spent months building on sand, lies, forgeries, manipulation. When the foundation cracked, the whole thing came down. Can we build something new on the truth this time?" I looked at my son, this man I'd loved since the moment Clara first put him in my arms 33 years ago, red-faced and screaming and perfect. "The truth is, you let someone poison you against your own father. The truth is, you stood by while she planned to destroy me. The truth is, you chose to believe lies instead of trusting the man who raised you." His shoulders shook with the weight of what he'd done, what he'd allowed to happen, what he'd been willing to sacrifice for the promise of easy money. "But the truth is also that you're here now. You're asking the right questions, and you're still my son." "What does that mean?" I headed for the door, then paused to look back at him. "It means we start over. From the ground up, no lies, no secrets, no pride getting in the way of what's right. But first you've got to decide what kind of man you want to be." As they led Morrison away in handcuffs, Detective Chen turned to me with news that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Whitmore, we have a problem. Your daughter-in-law posted bail an hour ago. She's gone." The next 6 months passed like a slow-motion earthquake, everything I thought I knew about my family shifting and settling into new patterns. Michael had filed for divorce papers within a week of Maisie's disappearance, sold everything he owned to pay what debts he could, and declared bankruptcy for the rest. He was living in a studio apartment across town, driving a 15-year-old Honda with 200,000 miles on it, working 18-hour days to rebuild his consulting business from absolutely nothing. Every Sunday he came to dinner. We didn't talk much about what had happened. We were too busy planning what came next. Eddie had accepted my offer to manage the property, and he was living in the apartment above the workshop now. Turned out he had a gift for growing things, and Clara's garden had never looked better. In the evenings, we'd sit on the back porch and talk about second chances and the courage it takes to do what's right when everything's at stake. The trial had been a sensation in Cedar Ridge. Morrison got 4 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. Carla Dean got 2 years. The State Bar Association stripped their licenses permanently and launched an investigation into every case they'd handled over the past decade. But Maisie had vanished like smoke on the wind. Detective Chen figured she'd probably crossed into Mexico, maybe changed her name. Started over somewhere, nobody knew her story. The warrant for her arrest was still active, but as the months passed, it seemed less and less likely that she'd ever face justice for what she'd done. That's when I got the knock on my door that changed everything again. Detective Chen stood on my porch, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her was a young woman, maybe 25, with Maisie's eyes, but something softer in her face, something that spoke of kindness instead of desperation. "Mr. Whitmore," Chen said, "this is Jessica Martinez. She has something she needs to tell you." Jessica stepped forward, nervous but determined, with the bearing of someone who'd been practicing what she was going to say. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Maisie's daughter. The one she gave up for adoption 25 years ago. And I know why she became the monster who tried to destroy you." I felt the ground shift under me like sand sliding away from a foundation. In 8 years of marriage to Michael, Maisie had never mentioned having a child, never talked about a previous relationship, never hinted at any life before she met my son. I invited them in, made coffee the way Clara had taught me, and listened as Jessica told me a story that painted Maisie in colors I'd never seen before. She'd been 17 when Jessica was born, abandoned by the baby's father. When he found out she was pregnant, kicked out by her own family for the shame of an unwed pregnancy in a small East Texas town where everybody knew everybody's business. She wasn't always a liar. Jessica said, tears in her eyes, as she looked at the photographs she'd brought. Pictures of a young girl who looked like Maisie, but softer, more hopeful, holding a baby with wonder in her face. The social worker who handled my adoption said she was a good mother for the first year. She just didn't have any support, any money, any hope. When she finally gave me up, it broke something inside her. Detective Chen pulled out a file thick with documents. We found letters she wrote to the adoption agency every year on Jessica's birthday. She never sent them, but she kept writing them. 25 years of guilt and regret. I read one of the letters written in Maisie's careful handwriting on paper that had yellowed with age. "My beautiful Jessica, you would be 7 today. I wonder if you like horses like I did when I was little. I wonder if you're learning to read, if someone is teaching you to tie your shoes. I got married last year to a good man. His father treats me like family, something I never had growing up. I want to tell them about you, but I'm afraid they'll think less of me. I'm afraid Michael will leave me if he knows what I gave up. I'm not the woman they think I am. I'm just a coward who gave away the most precious thing in the world." She carried that shame for 25 years. Jessica said, her voice steady, but her hands shaking, as she pulled out more documents, more pieces of a puzzle I was only now beginning to understand. It twisted her up inside, made her desperate to hold on to anything good that came into her life, even if she had to lie and steal to keep it. I set the letter down, feeling something inside me shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The woman who tried to destroy me wasn't born evil. She was born afraid, and fear had carved her into something cruel over decades of hiding and pretending and telling herself that the next lie would be the last one. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Jessica, studying her face for any sign of the manipulation I'd learned to watch for. "Because I want to meet her. Because I want her to know I forgive her for giving me up. Because maybe if she knows that she can start forgiving herself. And because I think you deserve to understand that what she did to you wasn't about you. It was about 25 years of believing she wasn't worthy of love." Detective Chen leaned forward. "She's been found. Arrested in El Paso 3 days ago, trying to cross the border with fake identification and $10,000 in cash. If you're willing to vouch for a supervised meeting, the parole board will consider allowing Jessica to see her." I thought about it for a long time, sitting in my kitchen with these 2 women who were asking me to help heal something I hadn't broken. Thought about Clara's note about building things that last, about the difference between justice and mercy. "I'll vouch for it," I said finally. "But I want to be there when you meet her." The prison visiting room was different this time. Brighter somehow, with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that had been cleaned recently. When they brought Maisie in, She looked healthier than she had during the trial. Prison had been hard on her, but it had also stripped away the pretense, left something more honest behind. She saw Jessica first, and I watched 25 years of guilt and longing crash into her face like a wave against stone. She sat down across from her daughter, separated by that same reinforced glass, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I know who you are," Maisie said finally, her voice breaking on every word. "I've dreamed about this moment for 25 years. I know what you did." Jessica replied, her voice steady but gentle. "To Mr. Whitmore, to his family. But I also know why you did it." They talked for an hour while I sat in the corner, watching a mother and daughter find each other across decades of separation and shame. Maisie cried when Jessica told her about her adoptive family, good people named Martinez, who'd loved her and raised her right, who'd given her everything she needed to become the kind of person who would drive across 3 states to visit a mother she'd never met. Jessica cried when Maisie apologized for giving her up, for not being strong enough to find another way, for carrying the guilt so long it had poisoned everything good in her life. "I want you to know something," Jessica said near the end of the visit, her hand pressed against the glass, as if she could touch her mother through sheer force of will. "I had a good life. I had parents who loved me, who gave me everything I needed. You made the right choice, even though it hurt." Maisie looked at me, then really looked at me for the first time since this all began. "Richard, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but will you help me be a better person? Will you help me figure out how to live with what I've done?" I thought about Eddie sleeping rough in a parking garage, but still choosing to do what was right. I thought about Michael losing everything, but finding himself in the process. I thought about Clara, who always believed people could change, if they really wanted to. "Maisie," I said, "I can't forgive what you did to my family, but I can help you learn to live with it. If you're really willing to do the work." That conversation set everything in motion for what came next. Maisie was sentenced to 5 years, served 3 with good behavior. She lives in a halfway house in Dallas, now working at a nonprofit that helps families avoid financial fraud. She sees Jessica twice a month, and they're building something that might someday become a real relationship. She's never asked to see Michael, and he's never asked about her. Some wounds cut too deep for healing, but that's okay. Not every story needs a perfect ending. 2 years later, Michael remarried a kindergarten teacher named Sarah, who reminds me of Clara in all the right ways. They're expecting their first child next month, a boy they want to name Richard. Eddie still tends Clara's garden and lives above my workshop, and we've become the family we both needed. I keep Clara's note in my toolbox, right next to the wedding ring she wore for 42 years. "Don't let anyone rewrite our story, Richard." I didn't. Our story stands exactly as we wrote it, and now a new generation gets to build their own. That was my story. Sometimes the people closest to you can become your greatest enemies. But if you hold on to the truth and surround yourself with good people like Eddie, you can survive anything. Have you ever been betrayed by family? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories like this. Remember, no matter how old you are, it's never too late to start over and build something stronger.